What do you think most people misunderstand about refugees? What do we need to help people, reboot their minds on the whole experience of being a refugee?
Well, I mean, I think one thing to remember is that refugee is not their identity, and they weren't always in this position of need. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that, again, back to our shortcuts, we are programmed to reject people who need something and to only look for people with potential to help us. So maybe it's a good idea to remind ourselves that these are people who were astonishing in their old countries. They all had something. They all had a talent. They all had a profession. They all had something that delighted their community. Whether it be, something they did for work, maybe they were a chef or a doctor or whatever. Maybe it was some kind of cultural talent or something. But we all have something, right? And that thing is hidden now. It's buried under the phrase refugee. I was born in Iran at the time of the revolution, and my family became refugees after the war with Iraq. So my mother was a Christian convert, which made things dangerous for her, and we escaped, and we were refugees for 16 months and then arrived in the US. I think when you escape, you're so concerned with just getting out right then and being safe and keeping your children safe that you don't think of all of the small things that you will never have again. And one of the parts of my mother's identity that I think was the most important to her, and I think another thing is you don't really realize how important certain parts of your identity are until you lose them. But, my mother was always kind of a top of her class, very smart student. And, there's this huge test in Iran, the test that they take at the age of 18. It's called the concours, and it's extremely difficult, and children study for it all through their teenage years. And my mother came, 17th in the country, which is such an accomplishment for her. And she was such a hardworking, academically minded, smart, and well-respected person in Iran. And she became a doctor and had her own practice. And then suddenly, when we escaped, I think she kind of believed that she would get that back really easily. But there was a language barrier, and there was the 16 to months to 2 years of losing practice. And then we arrived in Oklahoma, and she started to study again for the USMLE, which is the U.S. medical licensing exam. And it was really very, very difficult because we had been sponsored by a family who were a little bit right wing, and they were kind, and they kept us in their home for a little while. And I was so happy to have them, but they would not allow my mother to sign up for government assistance so that we could have money for food and things, because they thought that it was, the wrong thing to do. They said we are people who stand up, on our own feet. You have to work from day one. You can't be taking government help. And I think they had completely lost sight of what that government help is for. It's for people in moments of transition. It's so people can reach, their best selves. So my mother could study for the USMLE and become a doctor again. But she wasn't allowed to do that. Immediately she needed money. She felt under a lot of kind of pressure from these people. And so she took a factory job. And then she was doing that while trying to study. And of course, she never got the amount of time she needed to successfully pass that test. So eventually, though, once we were settled in, she studied to get a master's degree from the local university in health policy. And she did kind of medically adjacent work over the years. She always kind of joked, though. She's like, oh, well, I had a medical degree and now I have to get a master's. Like, what's next? Do I have to do my bachelor's again? Should I go to high school? It was, we always kind of laughed about that, the moving backwards. It's kind of great fear, I guess, of ours, but it's something that did happen to my mother. She would say, in her beautiful broken English, sometimes she said, I feel like I'm behind an unbreakable wall. She said unbreakable, which is what she meant is like just this wall that is other people move forward and I keep being pushed back.
And I guess a lot of people think about the initial trauma of leaving, but actually that unbreakable wall that your mum talks about, that lasted for a very long time, if not, indefinitely. Yeah. As things like the Ukraine refugee crisis continues, public interest goes down over time, but actually people are still having all sorts of ongoing challenges, aren't they, of integration and welcome and rebuilding a life.
I think rebuilding a life, but also just, assimilating to a new country, it's a lifelong thing. When you think about it, I think in my book, The Ungrateful Refugee, one of the things that I compare it to is just the way we assimilate individually to each other. Every time something in our life changes, when we, move in with someone, not just when we move to a different city, but every time someone new comes into our lives, it's such a long work of truly understanding that person, knowing their codes and their language and their signals, and just not being constantly doing the calculus of what does this person mean, and what am I meant to do here, and how do I not offend, and how do I show love and show gratitude and all those things. And I think, imagine doing that on such a large scale where everyone around you is that other person that you're trying to live with and assimilate with. And I think if we think of it that way, that this is something we all have to do over the course of our lives. It's this process of constantly assimilating. I think it's easier to understand how long it takes and how unreasonable it is for us to expect them to do it in, say, 1 year.
I feel like the current climate around migration in general, let alone asylum, has become a scarcity mindset. The UK is running out of resources. We haven't got enough space. We don't have enough housing. What about our systems? And actually, that's not based on evidence. That's based on prejudice. So if that's the mindset of everyone coming to the table, these reasonable, positive ideas become less possible, don't they? So I feel like we've got to change the wider narrative.
I mean, I want to ask the people who are scared of this, is when was the last time you truly, there was a job you really wanted to do and you lost that job to an immigrant, or a house you wanted and you lost it to an immigrant? These fears come from somewhere, but they don't come from actual experience, because the fact is that we are a resource-rich nation, and that the people coming in, they are not that many, and they take the worst jobs and the worst housing, and they contribute culturally, and over the course of say decades, they contribute massively. I mean, these people become doctors and asylum lawyers and all kinds of different wonderful professional people that they were before. And I think it's really important to remember that.
A lot of our guests tonight have come to the UK as refugees and might be feeling inspired to tell their stories. Do you have any tips or advice for them about getting started in beginning to have their own voice heard?
Well, I think the first thing to overcome is that fear of telling your story. One of my favorite writers, Primo Levi, wrote that, the survivor's greatest fear is that they will tell their story and they won't be believed, that the other person will just get up and walk away. And I think that it's very important to put that fear out of your head and to just understand that you're here in a country of people who want to know, they want to empathize, they want to befriend and love, and there's much love to go around you. But it's that work of opening up your heart and saying, I'm going to tell it. I'm going to tell it exactly as it happened, whether or not I'm believed. And so I think that is my first piece of advice, is to be strong, tell the story. But then also, I think one of the very most interesting things I learned when I was writing Who Gets Believed, I talked to this trauma doctor at Freedom from Torture, who said that, when we experience trauma, some of the things that our friends, these refugees, have experienced, the part of your brain that takes in information is the part that takes in sensory information. You lose so much of the contextual information. That's how trauma memory is formed. Unfortunately, when we go to tell our asylum stories, one of the, parts that needs to be fixed, so bad education parts, is that they are always asking all of these context questions, which the survivors don't have. And so I think once people have gone through that process, they're used to not being believed, because all these contextual questions that they've been asked, they didn't have an answer for. But here's the thing. Here is a way of telling a story that uses only the sensory information, the information you have, and that is art. Art and storytelling and writing, all it needs is the sensory information. Okay, so I say take that, and that contextual information that you didn't have before, it's no longer important, because you can create fiction. You can create something new, or you can just say, I don't remember this quite right, but here is what I do remember, and then take us into the sensory world of your mind. And that, it's valuable because it's art. And while it may seem frivolous to someone who has spent these years trying to just survive, I just want to say that it's important. And there's something great to be created from the memories that you do have.